The last 3 weeks of, and then we'll have another announcement. We have in the last 3 weeks of Solid Ground prior to September 8th, which is when we will kick off a year-long series that we'll talk about in a little bit here. But before I describe what we're going to do, what we'd like to do over the next 3 weeks, Dennis apparently has an announcement, unknown to me. So fire away, Dennis. What do you got?
While you were gone, I took a straw vote, and there was a groundswell that you should be allowed to resign, and Peter Tinkle.
I have actually submitted a resignation letter, and it's in the bureaucracy, and they say it'll be 2 to 3 years in processing, but they'll get back to me.
You would be allowed to continue on as
Isn't that? You're right. Hey, here's the pasture, and here's the fence. Yeah. No, I'm happy to do that anytime. Peter does a great job. Peter's a sleeper when it comes to, like, he's very unassuming. He doesn't. I won't talk about him as this positively when he's here, but he's as you notice, he'll sit there and wait. And I liken it to anybody who's seen the old, like, 80s and 90s wrestling, to the guy that gets up on the corner post and he just waits, and then he jumps in off the top rail and hits somebody. And you're like, where did that come from? That's Peter. Okay, so thank you for that. We have, what I would like to do, and this is subject to feedback, is 2 things. There's a subject that I would love to kind of facilitate and talk on for the next 3 weeks on a as much as we want to talk about it basis. But I would also like to use these last 3 weeks to do one of the core missions of Solid Ground, which is people have questions. We may or may not get to them as the normal part of whatever it is that we're talking about. But if you've had a question that you've been thinking about for a while, or one that we kind of skipped over and said, we don't have time to answer that one in full here, we'll talk about that at another time. Now's your time. So this week, next week, and the following week, if you've got a question, anything that we're talking about, these 3 weeks are meant for interrupt whatever's going on. Don't worry about that you're interrupting the flow. Ask the question that you always wanted to ask. We'll come off of the main topic that we're honestly really using as a filler in between these questions. To me, it's also one of my favorite topics, but I may be the only person that finds it to be my favorite topic. So it may also motivate you to ask other questions. So the topic, at that point now, we'll have dropped the go flag, and any question you want to ask, feel free to interrupt and do it, and we'll answer it as deeply as we possibly know how. In the meantime, what we'll talk about is there are several ways of thinking about knowledge at all. And as we had talked about in this class, one of the things that we were looking to do in Solid Ground is when we talk about a belief system, you not only need to talk about what you think about particular parts of your belief system, those need to fit with other parts of your belief system seamlessly and without contradicting the other ones. And that one of the ways that you can know that at least one of the things that you believe is false is if there's a logical contradiction between 2 ideas that you hold in your head that you affirm as true. This is not a religious construct. This is not just the case for stuff in religion. This is the case for everything. Let me say that again. This has to be the case for everything. If you hold a scientific belief, and here's an example of that one. If you hold a scientific belief in one tile of general relativity, and you hold another scientific belief of quantum mechanics, and you say, are they compatible? The answer is no. And physicists know this. And so the physicist answer isn't, well, we don't teach those 2 topics. What they say is, we are holding them loosely in our hands, hopefully is what they're saying, many of them are willing to say this. Something is wrong with at least one of these theories. We don't know exactly what it is, but we tried to unify it. We realized it can't be unified based on what we believe about both of them. So it doesn't mean you just throw the baby out with the bathwater, but what it means is there's something wrong somewhere, and they're waiting for the next theory to come out to kind of show that that's the case. Now, not everybody in physics acts like that's the truth, right? Some of them seem to represent the opinion of, this is unquestionably the case, we know for a fact, fill in the blank. And they say that. We now know, and they fill in the blank with what they now know. But if you get them cornered, even the most strident ones, and you say, are you saying that you know this is absolutely true? They will back up and say, no, this is our best idea right now. It seems to be well evidenced, but it's also, we know it's incompatible with this other belief. So we should be the goal is to find a set of beliefs that fit together seamlessly. For the Christian, anybody, any religion and any absence of religion, it ought to be, your religious or non-religious beliefs also have to seamlessly fit in with your secular beliefs, whatever that means, with your beliefs about the physical world. So sometimes you'll hear the Christian theologians say this: all truth is God's truth. So natural theology and biblical theology ought to match, because if the God of the Bible is the one who created stuff, then this is his creation, and so you won't find anything contrary to what he says in his creation or something like that. So it should be the goal of everybody who actually truly seeks knowledge and wants to be right, honestly cares about being right. And right, now there's three reasons to want to look right, to want to be right. One of them is because you like the respect that is tendered to people who are knowledgeable and have things quote unquote right. Okay, and that's the desire to look right motivation. That's not a good motivation, because it's about appearances.
That's the emperor's new clothes.
Yeah, so we'll say substance over or form over substance or something like that. The second reason to want to be right is something like I care for my own psychological reasons to be right, but that has less to do with my desire to fit into the reality than it does to do with me wanting to feel good about whatever it is that I'm doing. So this is I want to be the person who's right. It's important for me to be right because this psychologically works better for me. I don't want to interact with a bunch of people who might be right and I might be wrong. So I'm not going to do that. And this is I tend towards being one of these people. It's the worst of the two, in my opinion, to be, because what it basically says is I want to be my own little set of knowledge, source of knowledge, etc. It's a bad thing to be. The third and the right motivation is there is truth out there. I don't want to be a hypocrite. I don't want to be a liar. I don't want to cause other people to fall down. I want to do the right thing because the right thing is a higher ideal than me. For the Greeks, that right thing could have been prior to, and others, that might have been prior to some sort of gods. So the right thing is above the gods. To the Christian, the Muslim, the Jew, God sits above all of this and is the one on whom what is right and wrong is based. For other ways of thinking, even ones that are subjective, you'll hear atheists or agnostics or Hindus or whatever, Buddhists say that there might be a subjective measure by which we can all agree this is the right thing, and that should take precedence over the individual. So all of these groups are acknowledging that what is right ought to be higher, and it's really just a proper acknowledgement of that. Okay, why am I babbling about all this? The reason is there is a secret key to understanding when you are right or wrong, or when you've got something right or wrong, and when other people have something right or wrong. And most of the amazing thing, the absolute amazing thing to me, is that consider people in the world, our most brilliant scientists, our most brilliant philosophers, mathematicians, people who seek knowledge through truth, through beauty, religions of various ilks. All of these claim to be on a journey seeking truth. And so if you were on I'll put it this way, I'm trying to remember the name of the temple in India. There's some temple in India that's basically the outside's coated in gold. And inside were treasure chambers. And one of them is a treasure chamber with snakes on the outside. And supposedly there's evil spell, or not evil spell, Hindu spell cast on it. And whoever opens the door, bad things are going to happen, whatever else. But everybody was dying to know what's behind the door. Why? Because if you seek treasure, and like the 3 other rooms that they opened in this place had $18 bazillion in gold in them, and that's the one that's protected by 6 other places. So he knows the story.
I just read it on YouTube.
Okay, yeah, then and if it's on the internet, it's true. if you're a treasure hunter, you're dying to know what's behind that door. So a locked door to a treasure hunter is basically a thrown glove to a knight or something like that. It's a challenge that you can't drop. These locked doors that I'm talking about, people who are seeking knowledge will come up to a door, they'll examine the door, and they'll say it's locked, and I can tell you exactly what kind of lock it is. And I don't really know, I don't know where the key is. And then they walk away from the door. This to me is a measure that if you walk away from these kinds of locked doors, that you don't really care about the knowledge that you're talking about. These locked doors have a name in our language called paradoxes. A paradox is a locked door of knowledge that says, I know behind this door lies a secret. The secret is something that you believe is false. The answer is on the other side of the door, but you don't know how to get through it. That's what a paradox is. So sometimes it's the case that these locked doors are not actually locked doors. So getting rid of things that you think are paradoxes may turn out not to be paradoxes. But most of the time, a paradox highlights something that's wrong with your way of thinking. So a true paradox highlights an inconsistency, an internal inconsistency with knowledge that you say that you have, or inconsistency between two sets of knowledge that you hold.
Just because I don't like it being left where it is, it's not good to go behind every locked door, because the Lord says certain things like don't learn about witchcraft and that sort of
Yes,
stuff,
yes.
and don't experiment sexually.
Yeah, no, these kind of locked doors that I'm talking about are not doors that are locked. I'm using the analogy of a lock. Maybe it's a bad analogy. What I mean is, this is it's something that people have thought about so much that they've identified the paradox. They talk about it a lot, but they don't know how to get past it. And I think giving up is never the right answer when it comes to those. This isn't about seeking forbidden knowledge. This isn't about seeking knowledge that will bring you down. This is you saying, I believe beliefs A, B, C, D, and E. And when you say that, someone points out, if you believe B and you believe C, then this paradox falls out. And then you say, well, what does that paradox indicate? What it indicates is that either B is false, or C is false, or both are false, or some part of them are false in some way. So that's what I mean by paradoxes. So it's about beliefs, good beliefs that hopefully good beliefs that you already
I
hold.
agree with you, it's just...
No, it's a good caveat to put on it. Thank you. Yes, thank you.
I always look at paradox, just maybe compare it a little different way, in that on a given subject, there are truths about that subject, but some of the truths are diametrically opposed.
Okay, now what do you mean by that?
The
Yeah.
subject, technology. There are truths about technology that are good, and there are truths about technology that are bad. It is paradoxical. There are two opposing truths.
So give me an example of the truth of two paradoxically opposed truths, or two diametrically opposed truths about technology.
Unfortunately, the one that comes immediately to mind is sex.
Okay.
I shouldn't laugh. But it can be used for good and it can be used for bad. There are good sides to it and there are bad sides to it.
Okay, but that's
Same
not
way
a.
with the internet. There are good sides to the internet and there are bad sides.
But that is not a truth statement that is both true, that is both good and bad. Right? You're not making the statement. If you made the statement sex is good, and it turns out that sex is also bad in some acts, it's either the case that sex is good or that it's not good. If good and bad are opposite, it can't both be the case that sex is good and that it is not good. What we really mean when you say that, you have to nuance it and say, what am I saying when I say sex is good or sex is not good? What you really mean to say is, this application or this facet or this particular set of behaviors is good for the following purposes or under the following regimes, and it's bad under the other ones. So I'm not talking about that kind of stuff. I'm talking about a truth statement that says, I'll give you an example. I'm going to give some examples here, and then maybe that'll help. So I'm going to start in an obscure area, because I think that these paradoxes are fairly easy to see, even though we are probably not going to be familiar with the background knowledge in here, which don't worry about. So I'm going to talk about some mathematical stuff that trust me, if you care about, we'll talk about it another time. But most people don't care about this. There was kind of a crisis in mathematics a little over 100 years ago, where people were saying, we got problems, we got all these infinities, we don't understand how to deal with all this stuff in math. And so they put this big conference of people, mathematicians together to try to figure out how to do something about it. And guys were writing huge books. Russell and Whitehead wrote a book that's like this thick on logical mathematics. They were trying to base math in logic. And it took them famously something like 300 pages to get to the definition and proof of 1 + 1 = 2. So that's how boring it can be. That's how bad they got it. There was a guy who had written a bunch of this mathematical theory, and he had said, Frege, and he was about to publish some stuff, and this guy named Russell, Bertrand Russell, who's a kind of famous philosopher and mathematician from back in the day, writes him this letter and is like, hey, by the way, there's a problem with what you're saying, and he lists this paradox out. Frege quit math after that. He was like, oh no, this actually does undermine my entire work, and he left and was a very sad person for a very long period of time. It was a pretty sad story.
So do you look at Russell as a bad guy there?
Right. He probably didn't mean to crush the guy's soul, but that's what happened. So a set, mathematicians, when they talk now about stuff that they're adding together, they're really talking about sets. So you and I think of, like, it's math, it's numbers, 1, 2, 3, I don't understand what the problem is. These are the guys who are asking the question, what is 2? That's the kind of question they were asking. And what they decided they were going to base it on were these things called sets. And a set is a collection of objects or elements. There's your definition. It's a collection of objects or elements. It can be anything. It can be a collection of numbers. It can be a collection of fruits. It can be a collection of people. It can be anything you want. So Russell asked this question, and he says, let's think about the set. So by the way, in the set theory, individual parts of sets, the elements in sets, are themselves sets. So sets are like these Russian nesting dolls, but they can have multiple dolls inside each thing. So that's what set theory basically is. Russell asked the following question: what about the set of all sets that do not contain themselves? Now that's a little hard to think about. So I think he came up with this. It's called the barber's paradox. It says there's a town where people are not allowed to shave themselves, with the exception of one guy. There's one barber in town, and he's allowed to shave other people. So you can go to the barber and you can get a shave, or you got to wear a beard. You don't get to shave yourself. No razors for anybody. They're too dangerous. We don't know what the reason is why. But you can only the barber.
Has to have a beard.
So the question is, who shaves the barber?
There's nobody to shave the barber.
Okay, well the barber is the only authorized guy to shave.
But you're not allowed to shave yourself.
But you're not allowed to shave yourself. And so what he was pointing out was, this is a paradox. Okay, so the set of all sets that does not contain itself contains a statement that if it's true, then it implies that the statement is false. And if it's false, it implies that it's true.
You're not allowed to have a beard.
Right, and
So there are two rules, but they're both opposed to each other.
that's right. Well, there's one rule, which is nobody can shave themselves but the barber, or nobody can shave themselves and the barber, but except the barber, he's allowed to shave himself. So that's really a rule and exception.
So they're both pointing.
So they're pointing in opposite directions. That's a real paradox, okay? And that's one that, when you see that, that's a reason for saying something like this: such a thing must not be able to exist. It's one step beyond a simple statement like a square. This is a square circle. Well, what's the definition of a square? What's the definition of a circle? That statement must be false because it contains a contradiction. Or this guy's a married bachelor. Okay, that has to be false. That cannot be true because it contains a contradiction.
Well, this party might be a bachelor, but it's
Well, yeah, but then now you're qualifying it, right? So the
I
Russell.
don't see the paradox with the barber unless there's a rule that says you can't have a beard. Because otherwise he just has a beard. Anyone who doesn't want a beard, he shaves it. There's no problem.
Right, sorry, let's say that everybody's shaving in town.
Everyone
So
has
everyone
to
has to
shave.
shave, yeah. Everybody needs to be shaven, but you can't shave yourself.
Okay.
The barber can shave you. So now we got a problem. Yeah, thank you. I didn't call that out right. So Russell's paradox is an example of a paradox. And I think people came to the right conclusion, one of the right conclusions there, which is you can't have such a set. Such a set cannot exist. There's a problem though, and the real problem is deeper, which is they said any set should exist. There's nothing that prevents a set from existing, right? What stops you from grouping stuff together? Nothing, right? So is that a problem for set theory? Mathematicians, I'm not going to say they ignored the problem, but this was the adaptation to the problem. They didn't turn around and say, there's something fundamentally wrong with set theory. We're thinking about things the wrong way. I got to come up with something else to do. What they said was, well, we can avoid the paradox if we set up an axiomatic system. An axiomatic system is just a system that says this is true, and this is true, and this is true, and this is true, and they're like foundational truths, and then you build your system off of those. So you start out with these things that you don't have to prove. You just say that we're going to accept this. A is true, B is true, and C is true. If A, B, and C are true, then you can build these things. That's what math is today on set theory. And so there's a set theory called ZFC set theory that's actually the basis for all the math stuff that people do today. Or claim to be the basis for it.
Is this the null set?
So the null set, I'm going to talk about that one in a second. So in case anybody's wondering why we're talking about math, it's not for the purpose of math. It's for the purpose of illustrating what the smartest guys and gals in the world do when they run into these paradoxes. One of the things that they did was build axiomatic set theory, and they said there's just a rule. The rule is no set can be a member of itself, like in this particular way. So it was like, oh, that's a paradox. We'll avoid the paradox by saying you can't do that. All right? If mathematics is just a set of rules that you make up, there's no reason you can't do that. But if, like many mathematicians want to claim, that math is really something that's true about the universe and that we discover it rather than we make it up, then that can't be the case. And that's what I'm pointing out. Now I'll bring up the question. I bring this up because I actually think that in this class, I'm going to ask a question, and you guys, I will bet dollars to donuts, will be able to answer a question that mathematicians themselves, some of the best philosophers of mathematics and mathematicians who work in set theory, seem to miss all the time.
Isn't it possible that reality, absolute truth about anything, or reality, absolute reality, is so complicated that the human mind will never be able to comprehend it?
That's possible. If you mean comprehending all of it together?
Any so-called absolute truth, like the origin of the universe.
Okay.
I know you guys believe you know where it came from, because other than your working at this, maybe it is so out there that the human brain is incapable of understanding.
That's a fair, that kind of thing is a very big question. All right? And maybe it is hard or maybe impossible for the human brain to understand it or understand it completely. But
it sets these axioms or preconditions from which to build on. So yeah, now we can get it.
Well, so this was I was about to say. The cool thing about logic is logic lets us make statements that don't have to be as big as like this is exactly where the universe came from, and I can tell you in excruciating detail. But you can say things like this in logic, because I still run into people, very, very smart people, who will say things. I ran into a very smart guy the other day, brilliant guy the other day, who said, I do think that truth is, that there's no truth that's absolute. And everybody in this class has probably heard it by now. But the retort that I answered to him, I was like, well, except for that statement, right?
Yeah.
Right. So you would think that everybody had heard of that by now, but still people have not quite heard of that one. And so he was like, you saw him get floored for a second. He was like, what? It's not rocket science. It's just somebody just has to say that to you, and you're like, oh yeah, I got good point. So I think the value of logic is, and I've made the argument, I won't make it in here, you'll hear this one again in September, of theology, axiomatic claims, et cetera. And I guess I'll get to the point. Actually, hold on. I'll answer your question by using the example I was about to use. One of the sets, so Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, C stands for with the axiom of choice. This is all fancy stuff you don't care about. ZFC set theory is this set of axioms. And look at this nonsense, not nonsense. This looks insane, right? I don't even know what that means. It's some foreign language. For all x, for all y, so that for all z, there exists a z element of x, if and only if z exists, blah, 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 right? Doesn't matter. All of these can actually be expressed in regular English. That's just a fancy way. It's called predicate logic of saying it. Where's my, it does look, There is Hebrew in another part, but not here. Aleph null is. Where's our axiom of the empty set? Of course, I'm not seeing it now. Here we go. There exists a set such that X is not, there is no element within that set, basically. It's the axiom of the empty set. So the plain English for it says this: there exists a set that does not contain any elements. What's the problem with that statement?
Set of what?
You call it a set,
What's the definition of a set?
collection of things.
All right. Now, if a set, and this is what I'm getting at, and remember, the greatest guys in the world, for some reason, are just either skipping past this one or it can't be that they don't understand it. All right, so here's a definition. A set is a collection of objects or elements, and this backwards E means there exists. There exists a set with no objects or elements. And by the way, that set is the set that they use to build infinite sets. So there's the empty set, there's a set that contains the empty set, there's a set that contains a set that contains the empty set. And this brilliant mathematician named von Neumann was like, basically the first one is 0, the second one is 1, the third one is 2. That's how they correspond to numbers, and that's where you get numbers in this kind of category theory of set theory, on top of set theory. But what's the problem here?
You gotta redefine the first thing.
It can't be
A set is A,
not A at the same time.
and there exists a set that's not A. Right? So the whole project here was build mathematics on solid logical foundation. And one of our axioms contains a contradiction in the actual axiom itself. This is a problem. And this, to me, is an example of when people are unwilling to examine their own assumptions. Because at some point, remember, there was this conference and people were coming up with answers, and this isn't working, we'll have to come up with this one. Nobody wants to admit that like this whole project's not going to work, or at least this set of axioms isn't going to work, and what else are we going to do it on? Nobody wants to quit and be like, I guess we don't know what numbers are, because then now it makes you sound dumb. When a bunch of mathematicians come out of like the smartest guy conference on the whole planet, and like, we have concluded that we have absolutely no basis for even being able to tell you how 1 + 1 = 2. That's embarrassing. Or it makes you, if it's not embarrassing, it makes it sound like you don't know what you're talking about. Now, Plato famously said, the thing that makes me basically smarter, and I'm paraphrasing heavily here, the thing that makes me smarter than everybody else is I know that I don't know anything. And obviously he doesn't really mean that statement, but the purpose, it shouldn't be a shame to say, we really don't know that much. And I'm not attacking mathematicians here per se. I understand why it's hard to be where they are today. But this kind of stuff is the kind of stuff that you should say, all right, fine. Let's find out how deep this kind of rottenness goes. Let's see if we can cut it out. Let's see what we can do to go about fixing it. And to Dennis's question and then Peter's comment, Dennis, as you had pointed out, like, okay, well, what we'll do is we just go to a set of axioms. Those axioms have to be logically internally consistent. Otherwise, we know they're not good axioms. So it's not enough to say, I'll go to an axiomatic system. Or I'm just going to say there are brute facts that exist. If one of the brute facts that you think exists is something like there are no absolutes, well, then your brute fact alone is self-contradictory, and that can't be a true brute fact. If your brute fact is a set's a collection of objects, and your second brute fact is exists a set that's not a collection of objects, guess what? You got a problem, and it's that's not true. And this has led, like, I'm working in this stuff now. So I've asked the question for the Platonist. The Platonist out there thinks that objects and elements exist on their own. You can tell the Platonist, you can ask the Platonist the following question. Consider the set of all things, not a member of itself, but consider the set of all things that actually exist. Abstract objects, contingent objects, everything. Consider that set. Does it contain itself? So we are back to a version of Russell's paradox. But if you think about it for a while, and it takes a while to think through, but if you think about it for a while, what you'll realize is There should exist a set. So if nothing prevents you from making a set, there should exist a set of all things that are existing. But then, of necessity, it would contain itself. So you can avoid it by saying, well, then there's a set that contains the set of all things that actually exist, and you end up with this infinite regress of sets. And the implication here is sets are not fundamental things. They are mind-dependent objects that we use to group things together, but this group of apples and that group of apples is no different other than that you said what I'm going to call one set A and one set B. Therefore, set theory cannot be the most fundamental theory of what numbers really are. That's all. So that kind of stuff is important for us when we really seek truth. Now I know that's kind of mind-bending and why are we having to think this deeply and all that other stuff. It's very important because if you're not willing to understand this, and you say that you want to really understand all knowledge, then what you're saying is, I don't care about understanding the foundations, I just want to understand some part of this building. I don't want to know how the skyscraper is really built, I just want to know about floors 9 through 13. Or in America, 9 through 14, when there's no 13 or whatever it is. If you say, I want to be a civil engineer, you better understand something about footings and foundations. And in fact, you probably ought to understand that first, because you can build the best house in the world, but if you forgot to put the footings in there and you didn't run the gutters away from it, your house is going to be cracked and broken fairly quickly. Peter.
I was going to say, it reminds me of the Lawrence Krauss saying with the universe from nothing, when there's different kinds of nothing and they all mean something and they all have different properties.
Right. So Krauss is a really good physicist. He's a really motivated speaker, not a very good logician. And the problem with, here's why. By the logic, if anybody's ever taken a class in logic, it is, I'm happy to say it, it is insanely boring, unless you just happen to love that kind of stuff. But if anybody's ever played basketball, dribbling drills of running from one baseline to the other and just dribbling the ball back is also insanely boring. But you cannot be good at basketball if you can't do the fundamentals. And I'm telling you that you can't be a good thinker if you don't understand something about logic. I'm not saying you have to be conversant in predicate logic and understand that for there exists and all that stuff. I'm not saying that, but you got to understand there's some basic laws of logic, rules of logic that the best that we can tell have to be true. That if there are axioms, it's those rules of logic, that kind of stuff, and that there are simple ways to express this logic that really will help you think. And you have to understand something about what the nature of logic is. It is either the case that it's the language in which the mind thinks. Some people like to say it's the language in which God thinks, or something like that. But you have to understand that basically logic is prior to everything. Interpretation of scripture requires logic. Comprehension of truths like God exists requires logic. Comprehensions of statements like God does not exist require logic. So if you don't do logic's just another word for thinking properly. So if you're not willing to understand what thinking properly is, you're going to make mistakes like saying things like there are no absolute truths. And then someone's going to judo you really quickly and be like, except for that truth. And then you're going to look silly because you got flattened on your back right in front of everybody, right? You don't want to get pancaked in front of everybody if you can help it. Now that's if you're the I want to look right guy. If you're really, really good, you don't care that you got pancaked. But what it should inspire you to do is to then say, that's clearly wrong. Let me find, that was interesting. How did you go about doing that? I'm thinking logically. Tell me more about this logic.
I get pancaked a lot. No, isn't it what you're talking about, kind of the foundation of solid ground? Because like what you just laid out right there, that's pretty uncomfortable. Like I'm sure there's plenty of people who are like, yeah, don't worry about that little guy. You know what I mean? Let's just keep going. Isn't that kind of the foundation of this class, right? Is like, let's talk about the stuff that seems uncomfortable, right? Let's talk about the stuff that seemingly seems contradictory or that we've got hard questions about and actually like get our elbows deep in.
It's my desire that it be so. So far as we deviate from that vision that you just laid out, then I think we've missed the point that I would like to bring out. You may see this in September 8th, September 15th, whatever it is. I'll make a statement about kind of the preeminence of logic on this one, and we'll lose, if more people come to this class, as typically do when you start up a new series or whatever else, somebody's going to walk out, or they won't come back. And the reason they won't come back is they'll say something like this. And I don't, let me say that I don't blame them yet. It depends on whether I can state it well enough. But if they're walking out because they're saying, I hear this guy in here saying that he's a better thinker than God, if God says it's true, and this guy says I need to question it, then this guy's probably wrong. If he heard that, then fine, walk out. But what he heard was, then he probably didn't hear what I was at least trying to say. I was trying to say what you just said, so maybe I'll let you say it, and then they won't walk out.
Well, Danny,
Dennis and then Peter.
I want to go back to my original point, maybe I didn't express it right, but it's possible that the human brain that relies on its senses to do logic even,
Yes.
may be the wrong, may not be adequate to explain what the real truth, the real reality is. It may be beyond us. Logic is not infallible.
So let me ask the question when you say that, so that I understand your
I'm
question.
saying that that's true. I'm saying
Are you talking about so here's a circle. This is all reality. It's everything that exists and is true. And here's our little brain, right here. I've circled our little brain, which is tiny, and that's all we can comprehend of all of reality. Are you saying that we may never be able to comprehend all of reality? Or are you saying that there's no way for us to even comprehend parts of reality?
I'm saying that it is possible that whatever reality is, it's beyond our ability to comprehend it. That we don't speak the right language.
Okay.
That logic isn't even the right language.
Okay.
I'm not advocating this. I'm just saying that
I got you.
we're limited by our human brain, 5 or 6 senses, whatever we got. We're limited by that. And it's possible, I like to use the example of the goldfish in a bowl.
Yes.
He comes from a pond and now he's in a bowl. He can see out there, but he can never figure out why he can't get past that thing that just bumps his nose into. And he never will be able to comprehend it, or she.
So you didn't answer my question. Are you still talking about the whole circle, or are you talking about any one part of it? Is it impossible to know anything true about reality? Or are you just saying we'll never get the whole picture?
Actually, I'm saying both.
Okay, if you're saying both, then consider this. We cannot comprehend anything true about reality.
Wait a minute, let me think.
Yeah, good. If you're sensing a trap. Yeah.
Okay. I guess I'm saying that the language that we're speaking, the language any human speaks, may not be the right language. It may be, we're just dumb mammals on this speck of a planet. It may be that the real truth, or even part of it, is just, we're like that goldfish in the bowl.
I'm with you.
Explaining it very well.
No, I totally get it. But the thing I'm saying is the great thing about logic is this. With English or Chinese or whatever language you want to speak, you're going to make a statement that in your mind you understand to mean this. Forget the language in which it's said. But in your mind it basically says, there's something true out there. Okay, that's what you're saying. That reality is true. Reality is what it really is. As Aristotle said, to speak something that is true is to say about what is that it is, which is a fancy way of saying if you say something's true that is true, then you've made a true statement.
I'm not really saying that either. I'm saying
No, Aristotle said that. But
logic may not even be the right language.
well, what I'm saying about logic is the great thing about logic that helps us understand that it is the right language is that you can make a statement like that and say it is absolutely categorically the case that that's either true or it's false. And if you say something like, we cannot comprehend anything true about reality, we know for a fact that that statement is false.
Yes, the human mind knows this.
No, if that's the case, though, think about it. If that's really the case, if we can know for a fact, as much as we can know anything about reality, that that statement is false, it means that there's at least one true statement about reality that we can make that we know for a fact is certified as true. That should be exciting for people who seek knowledge. At least that's how I understand your question. There was Peter and then...
I was gonna say, like, if someone, you said someone might be thinking if they walk out and leave, it sounded like they'd be making a logical statement to themselves. So maybe that should be pointed out to them, like, hey, when abandon logic, disregard it, you're using logic to, as your excuse to leave, so.
I never seem to get it out of my mouth fast enough to stop that from happening, or well enough. Well, and there's also, I mean, we've talked about this in here too. You can make a statement that's true, and another person will not hear it, right? Consider even relational stuff. Somebody's angry at you, and fill in the reasons, and you say something to them like a true statement, I really love you. they may not hear that at all at that point, right? They'll consider that a weapon or sarcasm or whatever else. You're like, no, I really mean it. And they're like, no, you don't. Even our emotions frequently, well, two things, both our emotions and also otherwise held beliefs that we do not wish to let go of will stand in the way of us actually hearing stuff. You and I have had this discussion many times. And as we have agreed, and you probably said more eloquently than I, it's off, the number one task is getting rid of not necessarily those statements, but getting rid of the desire not to let go of those statements. If and only if you're not letting go of those statements because you're afraid of them being true rather than thinking that they're true or false.
I think this is correct. I was initially thinking that probably part of the problem we have with logic and reality and all that is language. It's just the language that we have to express it in. I was wondering if there is some language that, let's see, let me go this other place first.
Yeah.
It's very rare. I mean, probably a handful of times that I think I've had an idea that I couldn't express in language. Because all my ideas, all I can think normally is limited by my language.
Yeah.
And I wondered if there were other languages that do better expressing logic. And then I just wondered if the concept of what's true out there, part of what hinders us from understanding it, at least in my head, is language.
So I'll give you an example of why you're exactly right. And this is a whole field of logic, by the way. It's a whole field of philosophy that you're talking about. Philosophers will tell you that there's a difference between these two statements. This statement, A, the statement A is not strictly impossible, logically impossible, is what philosophers will tell you. This is a married bachelor. They'll say that's not logically impossible, strictly speaking. They'll say that's broadly logically impossible or contradictory. This is a married, unmarried man, because what it says is this A is B. Because we don't know the relationship between married and bachelor according to logicians. Like if you just look at this language as some sort of equation, it's a equal sign that says A equals B, or A is described by B, or really something like A implies B and B implies A or something like that.
It's somewhat dependent on definitions.
It is entirely dependent on definitions, and when you spell it out, what it says is this A is not A. Now that's strictly logically impossible.
On the definition of on, the prefix.
Yes, that's right. Or if you say this is a married, not married man. So yeah, say that you took it all the way to that level and you said, tell me what un means. So this is, I take some exception to this but I get what they're going after. Like I don't like the fact that people say, well, that's not strictly logically impossible. You're like, it is when if you want me to spell out every word to every definition, every statement we make is like this long. It's like reading German. So you've got to be reasonable about it. But okay, to get around what you're talking about, this was the whole project that logicians and mathematicians were trying to do. All this craziness that you see over here, all these kinds of statements, the way that people write things like this was intended to say that's a language that you can't get tripped up that way in. Right? You cannot make a statement in this language. The problem is, until you speak that language as fluently as you do English, you're going to make mistakes in this language, right? So,
It's just defined by whatever language you speak.
yeah, in short, I actually think that basically any human language can express fundamental truths as long as you're precise about the definitions of the language. Good enough for our purposes anyway.
So not to dwell on this, but so if I understand you correctly, like the definition, like, because when I look at that married bachelor, contrary to the fact that, because I can't pick up after myself and I have bad decorating habits, my wife calls me a bachelor all the time.
Right.
Those two things can't be the same, right? So like by the definition of a bachelor, we can call it B, but like I don't understand how that first statement could ever in any universe in any way be true.
This is where it's not. It's not, so you're not wrong. If you think of language as, instead of saying this is a sentence, that you say this is an equation.
Okay.
So this right here, when you say 2 equals 1 plus 1, technically, the mathematician who's on his game will tell you that's a sentence. And what they're saying is, you make the statement, 2 is equal to, the value of 2 is equal to the value of 1 added to the value of 1, where addition means taking these two values and aggregating them, collecting them in such a way that you then evaluate the value of the group that you made. Hence the set theory is kind of where this comes from.
So you're
Part of where
basically
it comes from.
those two things say the same thing, it's just this, the B statement is more mathematical.
So what I'm saying is this, you can write this equation like this as well. So you know how you can divide things on other sides of the equation? This one right here is a statement of identity. Nobody's going to disagree that 2 equals 2. Some people will say as Platonic objects, 1 plus 1 is not the same thing as 2, because this has a plus sign in it and it's got 2 numbers in it. This is just 1 number. So don't tell me that 1 number and 2 numbers and an additional operation sign are identical, because I just told you some properties that are different between the two. They're not. Now this may seem like, to those who aren't bought into this project, as like, are you guys serious? Have you lost your minds? So that's right. That's a good question. Are you guys serious? Now, yes, some of the guys are serious about this. My point is, you don't have to talk about it at this level, but you have to understand that these are different statements, and that ultimately, if you really want to prove to somebody that what they said was contradictory, you have to at least be able to do this, which is just another way of doing this. So I'm just telling you that when it comes to doing judo, there are like 3 things that you have to know how to do. You know, the arm bar, the rear naked choke, and fill in the blank with whatever it is. If you can do those 3 things, you're going to do fine. These are those fundamentals. Yes, sir.
You and I have been going round and round for years. And I've said, I'll never take
true,
advice
Dennis.
and spell the word, and that's about it.
This is the top rope stuff I'm talking about. Peter just said it's absolutely true that we've done that for the last 3 years.
Isn't it true that logic is only good to prove the consistency of an argument, but that you can't use logic to prove a truth?
So this is a very, Dennis has just delved deep into the stuff that I just talked about. Gödel's incompleteness theorem basically makes a statement. I'll say why this is interesting in a second. It seems uninteresting to the non-mathematician, non-logician. But what Gödel said was something like this: no axiomatic system, in any axiomatic system, there will be at least one statement that is not provable within that system. That's true of axiomatic systems. So if you think that all knowledge is an axiomatic system, then that statement would also apply. So this is why, this is when the mathematicians kind of gave up on the project, was all those boys had gotten together and they were under Hilbert, the great Hilbert mathematician, were saying this is our project to base it all on logic, we'll be able to solve it. Gödel was actually given a lecture across town, or maybe another part of town, that basically was the foundations of disproving that and killing that whole project. So Gödel's incompleteness theorem basically says systems have to be self-consistent, but there's at least one statement in there that you can't prove within that system. So it's because of the limits of axiomatic systems. And axiomatic systems are language-based. But I don't know that that necessarily means that it's because of a limit of language. It's a limit of the ideas. If you're going to base something, if you're going to say, here are these 3 fundamental truths that I'm just going to believe, I'm not going to question them, there will be one statement that you can make within that system that is not provably true, which leaves you hanging, right? So the question is, what axioms are you going to adopt? If you think all systems are axiomatic, then what axioms are you going to adopt, and what are you willing to be wrong about? Now, Gödel came...
What I'm really saying is that logic is only good to prove or disprove that an argument is consistent within itself. But it can't prove the truth.
Well, I think we're making there's an assumption in there, if you want to call it an assumption, that says something like this: if it's not consistent, it cannot possibly be true. So that's the reason that we talk about consistency. If something is inconsistent, it absolutely is the case that it cannot be true. Because we believe, I think basically if you're looking for what the axioms are, these are the axioms. So that little squiggle line just means not. These are classically speaking, the three most fundamental laws of logic. A is A, right? It is what it is. It's either your birthday or it's not your birthday. Can't be both. You're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. It can't be both. And it is either the case that you're pregnant or it's not the case that you're pregnant. There's not a third option in there. So these are the kinds of things that you can say all day long, as I want to as well, Dennis, like, well, I don't want an axiomatic system. Well, look, if you've got a way to think of how something can be true where these don't hold, then we can talk. And some people have. There are logic systems out there that say, no, we can hold things together that aren't true, that are not consistent, but I'm still going to affirm that they're both true. The problem is, as Ravi Zacharias said, you can prove that all day long, but the guy who still says that in the lecture hall will look in the street before he stands there, before he crosses it, to see whether a bus is coming, because it's either the bus or him. And there's some truth. There appears to be inescapable truth from that.
So everything is based on at least one axiom.
Yes.
Everything.
Yes.
For me, that's a problem.
Well, all of them are. There is something that we would say. Think of it this way instead. We're back to our circle of truth. All right. So instead of a circle of truth, for the purpose of this, let's say that there's a set of truth out there, and that is based on something. And then let's say that stuff outside of this box. So in here, this is true. Statements that are outside of this box are false. Let's just say that's the case, that this is our picture of the world. And I think we can agree on that one. Things are either true or they're false. Well, unless, you can have nuance in there, but at base, it's either true or it's false. It's either correct or it's not correct. It's either real, another way of saying it is this, it's either real or it's not real. It's pretend. It's either real or it's pretend. It's actual or it's not actual. There will be some basis for this reality. We would expect that the bases of truths, or at least the way that you can express what is true, that those things, that this part, that there will be at least one foundation, and there won't be an infinite number of foundations, probably. But let's say that there's got to be at least one foundation for your building. Like, that doesn't seem bad to me to say your building has to have a foundation of some sort. We just want to know that that foundation's solid.
So
The
there's
point he
gotta
made
be-
earlier.
You gotta start with an axiom.
Yes. And the axioms that I would start with is not the axiom of the empty set. The axiom I would start with is, axioms are this. So if you and I mean, do you disagree with any of these three?
But I never took logic. I'm gonna say that based on the axiom, I'm gonna say that human perception may not be capable of understanding whether that's true or not true.
If you really believe that that's the case,
I don't believe, I said it's possible.
if you really think that that's possible, then what do you actually do on a day-to-day basis?
What do I what?
Do on a day-to-day basis?
I still didn't.
On a day-to-day basis, do you act like you think that's true?
Oh, certainly.
You act like you think it's true that you can't know anything at all.
No, I act like all this stuff is true. I act like Big Al is sitting right in front of me.
Right,
I
right.
act like John is sitting over here. I act like you're
Not a complete jerk. I think,
But that's just my perception.
sure, but that, let me put it in language terms. That's what you believe.
Sure.
And right now, at least in this kind of environment, we're talking about true beliefs and not true beliefs. So you can agree that at least what you believe, that you've already said it yourself, it's either true that all this stuff is like, I don't know what I'm talking about, this is all wrong, or there's some reality out there that can be comprehended. So you said possible. It's possible that we don't understand anything. It's possible that we do understand some things. That's a logical statement. That statement itself, it's either possible. Look what you just said. You said this. So well done, Aristotle. You're on track as far as I can tell.
That's an axiom.
Oh, well, you the one who made it. You stated it, and you said you believed it's true.
I said, because it's based on an axiom that makes sense to my perception.
Sure. But the fact that you even made the statement goes one level below the axiom that you're saying.
So, still stuck on language. I guess language itself is sort of an axiom. I mean, in that, I wanted to add a third statement to the Bachelor that bachelor equals not married man. Wouldn't that, I mean, does that become?
That's this.
Just a definition? Is it an axiom, or are word definitions part of the assumption, the base that we have to build all of our logic on?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole branch of philosophy about is what we perceive in our senses even real? Technically, everything that you perceive in your senses happened in the past, because it takes some amount of time for the light to hit your eyeball to then go through your brain and all that stuff. So you never actually see the present. You never hear the present. Is that, So, this is fun kind of stuff to talk about, but it doesn't mean much at the end of the day. This is the kind of how many angels dance on the head of a pin stuff. We're still going to walk out through the door. We're not going to walk out through the wall. And on basis of that, I will say, you'll hear people question the reality of this kind of stuff. Nobody walks out of the room and acts like they think that that's questionable reality. Everybody acts like it's either the bus or it's me. It's either I eat or I starve to death. Like, it's an academic exercise in silliness to deny this kind of stuff to my mind. Al?
Yeah, I was going to mention one thing that we would agree with that Dennis was talking about years ago when we were emailing, is that you need more than logic. Logic alone isn't enough to, and he pointed out how in every argument you have to, the premises have to be true.
Sure, but I think the apologist for logic would paint with a broad brush and say that is part of logic. That logic is a language.
And you can demonstrate it logically that you need more than just, yeah.
Right, but then in the exercise of all that, well, I think what people would say is your definition of what is logic is too narrow. That expressing truth in some formula with an eye to evaluating whether it is true or false, that's really the heart of logic. And that right there doesn't seem, you don't need more than that. I mean, you need the language, but you already said it ahead of time that it's a language of some sort. Peter and then Dennis. Did you have a point? No, maybe it was, Bill.
How does the law of non-contradiction deal with paradoxes?
It ain't a paradox if you don't believe in the law of non-contradiction. That's a great question, and that's the answer to it. Thankfully, this one has a simple answer. If there's the law of non-contradiction, there is no such thing as a paradox if you don't believe in the law of non-contradiction.
If you don't believe it.
Yes. And there are people who tried it. There are systems of logic, not very popular ones because they seem kind of silly to most people, that say, yeah, we don't have to accept the law of non-contradiction. I can be both pregnant and not pregnant at the same time in the same way.
That's the if and only if.
Yeah.
Then if you do that, if A and not A, then does that mean that it's either true or false? There
Yes.
are only truths or there are only false things, only black?
Any statement that expresses a truth,
Yes or no?
any statement, any proposition that makes a truth claim
Yeah,
is either true or it's false.
there are no babies.
It depends.
I'm sure you could
So
phrase the
so
question.
then how do people deal with reconcile? Like there are atheists that have one, that only natural truths are true.
Okay.
Theists, only God truths are true. Then there's some of this mass middle that say, well, yeah, most of this I believe, but how do they handle that in between?
There is
How do people reconcile?
a guy that
God
I imagine,
line up with natural truths.
there's a guy that I imagine Al knows, Greg Bahnsen, or knows of him. This guy was a presuppositionalist type who had some debates. And I'm giving a long answer to a short question, but the short answer to your question is people who make those statements, in my opinion, just haven't thought all the way through their own thinking on it. So he's in a debate with another guy who basically affirms that the natural world is all that there is and all the rest of this is nonsense. And so he gets to the question and answer part of this debate. This guy, Bahnsen, died of a heart attack like a decade and a half ago. But he's not around producing work anymore. But this guy basically said, was going to this was judo, right? Or jujitsu. So he thinks he's going to pin Bahnsen here. He's going to throw Bahnsen, and he says, you keep talking about God, this immaterial thing, this non-physical thing. Tell me, other than God, tell me one thing that exists that's not material. And Bahnsen says, laws of logic. And the guy who had just made a statement earlier about, yeah, absolutely logic exists, absolutely we have to use it. In fact, if you're being illogical, you know what you're doing, just got flipped really quickly. Because he hadn't bothered to think through the fact that the truth, the expression of a thought is not a material thing. So in any case, I just think people, it's hard to think about this stuff sometimes. And so I think people just sometimes haven't bothered. Now, I don't think, I'm not saying that everybody, even in this class, you guys are an awful clever bunch. Not even in this class do I think people should be like, well, I'll just go learn predicate logic until I can speak in the language of predicate logic and nothing else. I need to do that. I'm not saying that. I don't think you have to do that. But I think you do need to be able to understand statements like this. Like if you think about that long enough, you get that expresses a truth. And so I think that those kinds of, or this kind of stuff, you get this, right? That's not beyond your ability to comprehend. And that's the kind of stuff that I think everybody needs to do. Even, let's say that you're fairly mentally handicapped, right? Let's say that you got an IQ of 80. If you wrote this, and you don't even have to write this on the board, forget about writing it on the board. You go to a guy who's got an IQ of 80, and you're like, I need you to change, Marine Corps, we'll employ a guy with an IQ of 80, we'll make him a truck driver, that's fine. He's got a flat tire. You go pull that tire off the truck, lay it on the ground, and you say to him, I want you to do something with these 2 tires. He's going to look at you and say, there's not 2 tires there, there's only 1 tire there, tough guy. He can look at a statement like this. You can put 2 tires on the ground next to each other. You can put 2 other tires on the other side of the truck and ask him, are there the same amount of tires on either side of the truck? And he's going to tell you, yeah, and he's not going to be wrong, right? That is logic that he's doing. That's an expression of a truth like this, and that doesn't take a rocket scientist to do it. So I'm not saying that you have to do it at the highest level. I'm saying you need to be prepared to do it at the lowest level.
You said we may ask a question off something anytime.
Yeah, but preferably not in literally the last 4 minutes of class, yeah.
Well, because
You want to save it till next time? What is it? And we'll see if we save it.
Peter, over the last week, 2 weeks, we got into what is Calvinism.
Yeah, no, I'm not doing that in the last 4 minutes of class.
I didn't bring it up. Someone
That is still a mystery to me. What is the difference between all those different isms that he was talking about?
We can address your question next time, but let's give it proper shrift. And unfortunately, we're probably out of time for that one.
I have a question.
Everybody saving their questions to the last 4 minutes. New rule: in the next 3 weeks, don't save your questions to the last 3 minutes. Sorry, yeah. Interrupt me.
If
Throw the
logic is all that's necessary to, and this is just a good question to answer, if logic is all that's necessary to prove truths, do you use logic to prove the validity of logic?
Right. Now that's a great question. So he's basically asking this question: if logic, so here are truths. These are true things. This should be, now we're using logic here, but these should be identical to reality. This is very important. In fact, thank you. This was not paid advertisement, but I'm going to leave you the teaser trailer for what we'll talk about next time. Because if you're wondering, like, Scott, thank you for dragging me out Sunday morning to talk about this stuff. This has been probably the worst solid ground class I've ever been through. If you keep doing this kind of stuff, we're not going to just leave the class. We will attempt to have you thrown out of the church on behalf, not for heresy, but for blatant stupidity. I agree with you, okay? So there's a point to all this one. I will get to exactly what the point is next time, but it has to do with Al's question, and it has to do with something called the liar's paradox. And then I think you're going to have, and then I'll throw a little bit of teaser out there, and I think you'll be fairly excited. I hope you'll be excited about this. The liar's paradox says something like this: this statement, yes, is false. Or this has its roots in a Cretan philosopher from back in the day who said all Cretans are liars. Well, there's a problem. He's a Cretan. So is that statement true or not? Or something like, there's another version of this one is something like, Yes, something like that. So these are all versions of the same paradox, and that's exactly it. Al, your question is the answer to your question is the answer to your question is the solution to the liar's paradox. And by the way, all that fancy schmancy stuff that Gödel did on incompleteness theorem is, in my opinion, and other people's it seems as well, nothing but a mathematical expression of that paradox. That's what the incompleteness theorem is about. Gödel, by the way, a German with the round glasses and everything, he's immigrating to America basically right before World War II kicks off. And he does the citizenship stuff, and he's like, and he's the kind of guy that studies the Constitution as a result of this one. He says to some of the Americans that are helping him get citizenship, he's like, hey, I want you to know I found a internal contradiction in the Constitution, and do you want to hear about it? And they're like, why don't you keep that to yourself for now? I think I asked this. Does anybody remember what the problem with the Constitution is? You can amend the Constitution. Can you write an amendment that says you can no longer amend the Constitution? So Gödel thinks this kind of stuff. That's what he writes. But all that's doing is thinking about paradoxes like this. Right? So imagine the day somebody writes, hey, you can't amend the Constitution anymore. Guess what? Constitution's dead as a document that can be amended unless somebody wants to come back and amend it, but now it can't be amended again, so you have to throw it out and write a new Constitution. So don't do that. And don't tell anybody that one. Maybe Gödel should have kept that one to himself. Okay, we will use this is the master key that unlocks the box of keys that unlocks all the paradoxes. All right, the solution to this right here, in my opinion, is the master key to the box of keys and unlock all the other paradoxes. Let me give you some of these other paradoxes. Some of them you have heard, some of them you know. You guys remember this was an interesting one. There's the door. You want to walk out the door. So you get up from your chair. In order to walk out the door, you have to cross half the distance to the door. And then you have to cross half the distance again. And then you have to cross half the distance again. And you have to cross an infinite number of half the distance in order to get to the door, so you can never get out the door, because you have to cross an infinite number of things in order to do so. Paradox. There's a paradox of motion. A guy shoots an arrow, he shoots an arrow. At every instant, that arrow is not moving. And if all of the instants you add together are simply that arrow not moving, then the arrow can't possibly be moving. By the way, the philosopher that tried to disprove that paradox did so by demonstration. When someone said it's impossible to move, he didn't answer it. Someone said, this philosopher said it's impossible to move, here's why. The guy thought about it, and then he stood up and he walked across the room. And he was like, it doesn't. It's not a proof against it. So the question is, what's the key? What that ought to do is tell us we have empirical. So that's the difference, by the way, between philosophy and science. And you said it exactly right, Dennis, and I'm never going to let you forget it. So thank you for doing that. Philosophy says you can't move. Science says, let's examine that. I see empirical evidence that suggests you can move. And the philosopher says that's not proof that this statement, that this is false. That still needs to be stated in some logical form to show you why this paradox is false.
The fact that you don't really resolve whatever.
That's right. And so now we have to figure out how to resolve the paradox. So there's all these paradoxes that are out there. Some of them are interesting and fun paradoxes. And I'm telling you that I think that there's a master key out there. And what I'll do next time for you is hopefully, without showing you first how the key is used to open the box, I'll list 5 or 6 of these paradoxes and then show you the solutions. And if you think the solutions are good, then hopefully your appetite's whetted for how did we get to this point? How did we understand this is the case?
Is this going to get you a trip to Oslo?
A trip to where?
Is this going to get you a trip to Oslo for the Nobel Prize?
Good grief, no. Absolutely not. Nobody in their right mind would do that. And I don't know that this is. I think the solution to some of these paradoxes is of significant academic interest, but a lot of argument has to be done, and nobody's really fond of outsiders doing that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, I don't think this is not rocket science. I think everybody kind of knows this. I think a lot of people just ignore it. So you'll decide. You will be the judge in that case. Okay. Now let me tell you what the point is of that, and then we'll be done this time. Why am I interested in talking about paradoxes and whatever questions we have? We'll answer these other ones too, hopefully next time. there are in Christianity paradoxes. You've heard them expressed. The Trinity is a mystery. You can't understand how it's the case. To the point that you didn't bring up, but Dennis mentioned, God is either sovereign and made you do all the things that you're doing, or you're responsible for your own free will, or a compatibilist answer, it's both. But you see how that, at least the way I've expressed it, makes it sound like it's either one or the other. It can't be both in the same way at the same time. No human discipline of knowledge, to my knowledge today, an important major branch, is free of paradox. This should be deep motivation for us to go after it hard. And if I'm encouraging you to do anything, it's this. If you know of a paradox in your belief system, do not quit. Because the one thing, if you're any of these three, if you care about looking right, if you care about psychologically being right, or you actually genuinely, good-heartedly want to be right, I'm now throwing the gauntlet down. You cannot possibly have a belief in your mind that you know is in tension, is a contradiction, is a mystery, and you say, I don't care to resolve it, I'm just going to buy it. You can't do that and want to be one of these three people. You can't. And two of them are wrong, remember? And you can't really want to be the right one if you do that. So now I'm daring you. You don't get to do that anymore. You sat here too long. Welcome to solid ground. So now you got to figure out how to do it. I'll give you what I think is a way to approach that, the right way to approach that in my mind, and then you can decide what you want to do. In the meantime, last thing, so if you want to do anything this week, figure out what the solution to the liar's paradox is. Keep it to yourself at the beginning of class next time if you figure it out, and then we'll talk about it next time. It's also the case that I'm finishing the syllabus for basically the next year. As we have said, the idea is that we want people who are not just this group. You guys have now thought about these topics so much that whether you like to admit it or not, you are local experts. And if you think you're not an expert, then at least think about it this way. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. You've got at least one eye now. You now have a responsibility to lead the other blind. And I'm not trying to be elitist in here, but you guys are bothering thinking about this. So at least in the thinking about it side, you know a lot more than a lot of the folks in this church do. So now you have a responsibility to share some of this stuff with the folks in the church and in other places. So for that reason, I am hoping that you guys will put some topics forward that I want to make sure that we have in the syllabus when I basically make this goal for solid ground over the course of the next year. If you took a year to rigorously, scientifically, philosophically, not too fancy, but so that everybody can understand it, prove that Christianity is true in such a way that there's no wiggle room, how would you do it? That's what we're going to do in a year. And this is not a small project, right? And that means the first few we're going to be scoping and we're going to be doing all kinds of special stuff. But at the end of that year, you ought to be able to walk out with a firm set of, this is absolutely rock solidly the case, and maybe this is stuff that doesn't matter, but this does matter and it's true. Or you should walk out and be like, hey, I looked at it and examined it. Either Christianity ain't true, or at least this clown doesn't know how to prove that it is. That's the goal for this next year. So you guys tell me what you insist on seeing in this class, but I hope and expect that you will help guide those who come in here on September 8th to do so. Secondly, it's also my goal I'm not looking for a Christian echo chamber. Many thanks genuinely to Dennis for continuing to come into we're not hostile to Dennis, but the ideas are hostile and inimical to Dennis's ideas. So the fact that he comes in here, huzzah for Dennis, and thank you very much for doing it. We need more Dennis in this class. And so if you got anybody on the outside, I'm begging you, figure out how to get them in here. And if not, at least ways that we can go about advertising this class in such a way that people who are genuinely interested in the answer, I'm not looking for people who are willing to argue for no reason, or for the sake of argument. I'm not looking for people who want to compete, but looking for people who genuinely want to represent their viewpoint, are good at understanding their viewpoint and representing it, and or are curious about doing that kind of project. Please do tell me how you think is most effective to bring them in here. We have some ideas, but we need more. All right, I've gone past time again. Thank you very much for your time. Somebody solve this paradox between now and then, and we'll hit it next time. And I promise you it'll make sense as to why I'm doing this next time, if it hasn't made sense already. You guys have a great week, and please do submit on the page anything that you want to see covered. Thank you.
you know, Heather and I saw a pair of docs at the hospital.
I saw that.
Walking right toward us.
But were they truly a pair, or were they two single docs who just happened to be moving in the same way at the same direction?
A pair of single docs.
Yeah. Wait, that's the same
Single
thing, isn't
pair of
it?